In this session, we're going to talk about a place where the field of religious studies and psychology, which is an area called the psychology of religion, comes about, where that intersects. But before I do that, I want to make reference to one of these paintings that's behind us. This painting here by Paul Gauguin is one that's called "Where Do We Come From?" And actually up here in the corner, there's three handwritten questions. Where do we come from? Where are we going? And why are we here? And then he's done this painting with people just kind of doing normal, mundane life activities. And yet the implication is that under even the most mundane of things that we do, we're still at some level, consciously or subconsciously, dealing with these questions of, what's my origin? Where did I come from? Am I an accident? Did I come about by random acts of nature? Or am I planned and purposeful? Where am I going? Am I going to death and a grave and back to the earth and the dust of the earth? Or am I going to something even beyond that? And then why am I here? Are we here just going through life with no purpose or no meaning in anything that we do? Is there a universal purpose or meaning that we need to tap into and participate in to really live life as it was intended by wherever this meaning came from? Or is it our responsibility to just create meaning in the moments and in the activities and in the relationships that we pursue? What's the reality? What's the truth? Is there any truth about our origin, our destiny, and our purpose? And I probably should have talked about this more at the end of the last session on how the study of religion helps us to clarify our own personal value systems, because that's a part of what determines our personal value system. Do I think there is some larger meaning that I need to tap into and participate in? Do I think that there's not really that larger meaning, but I have the capability of producing meaning in what I do? Or is there really no purpose or meaning in anything we do? Life's just a random series of events that we make the most of. And how we think about those questions, how we answer those questions, determines the type of value system that we live by, the type of value system that we set up in our lives. And as you probably would know, or you might assume, all religions deal with these questions. Where did I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And so in studying religion, we get an opportunity to see how other people, other religions, other cultures, maybe even people of our own religious background, how they might deal with some of those questions. And it provides the opportunity for us to think about how we want to clarify, how we answer those questions, and the value systems that we set up in response to how we answer those questions. So these questions are a key part of kind of our own self-understanding, of clarifying our own personal value system. And those questions have a lot to do with what we want to talk about today. If you've been in any other class or any other field of study that has to do with human behavior, you've probably run across stages of development. And if you take a psychology class, you probably could not take a psychology class without in some way running across people like Freud's or Erickson's stages of psychological, psychosocial, psychosexual development. Stages that people tend to go through as they mature in life. If you take a sociology class, you probably, somewhere along the way, were acquainted with stages of development of groups. That as groups come together and form and coalesce, that they move through stages of development, typically. If you've been in any education classes, you've probably had to learn and maybe put some practical application to stages of educational development or stages of learning development. I think Jean Piaget is probably still one of the classic writers that's used in that regard. Stages that kids and adults move through in life that indicate what kinds of things we're capable of learning, the ways we're capable of learning, the kinds of concepts we're capable of grasping at different stages of development. Well, as you look at those stages of development, it's not that somewhere along the way a kid says, I think I'm going to enter into Freud's stages of psychosexual development. Or it's not like a kindergartner says, well, I think it's time for me to enter into Piaget's stages of educational development. These are just stages that human behavioralists or students of human behavior have observed typically in people's lives, stages that people tend to move through. Well, in the field of religious studies, particularly the field of psychology of religion, you often run across something that may be called stages of faith development. Stages that people move through in life as basically they're trying to answer these questions of meaning that I referred to initially. Where did I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? I want to acquaint you with those. Here at Missouri State, this class in Religion 100, Intro to Religion, it fulfills the general education requirement. And in your general education package, it falls under the category of self-understanding. And so I feel like at least putting this theory of faith development, or one of the theories out there in front of you, gives you the opportunity, if you choose to take it, to gain a little more self-understanding as well. So I'm going to use a paradigm created by a man named James Fowler. And I've made a few modifications to it that kind of click more for me that I'll let you know were mine as we go through. But we're going to look at James Fowler's stages of faith development. First of all, Fowler starts out by defining what he means by faith, which I think is really important to understand, because it's right now some of you may be going, I'm not a person of faith, so this doesn't have anything to do with me. Or I kind of abandoned faith and religious faith, so this doesn't have anything to do with me. Well, by Fowler's definition, this paradigm has to do with all of us. Let's look at some of his definitions of faith. He says, first of all, that faith is a consequence of the universal human burden of finding or making meaning. Faith is a consequence of the universal human burden of finding or making meaning. So what does that mean? I think he's saying we all deal with these questions, like the Gauguin painting lays out. Questions of meaning. Where did I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And as we come to places where we negotiate what we think about the answers to those questions, Fowler says the consequence of that negotiation is faith. Because we are placing value, we're placing faith, we're placing belief in whatever our answer is to that question. If I say, I think I came about by random acts of nature and evolution over time, I think I'm here to create the most meaning that I can in every moment, and I think that when I die, hopefully I've made the most of life, and my body will go back to dust and contribute to the natural system of things. Well, Fowler would say that belief about who we are is faith, that we're putting faith in a certain understanding about the nature of our lives. If I think that I was created by some divine entity, and that divine entity has a specific purpose that I need to find and tap into and live out in my life, and that if I tap into that and I fully live out that meaning, that where I'll go is to spend some sort of eternity with that Creator. Again, Fowler would say that negotiation of answers to these questions of meaning, that consequence to these answers of questions, that's faith. What I've decided to put my faith in as far as understanding the nature of my life. He says that faith is a human universal that's generally expressed through rituals, symbols, and beliefs, or even through particular religious traditions. So he's not necessarily even saying that faith has to do with religious tradition, but he's saying that whatever we choose to believe gives our life meaning, or whatever we choose to believe about the meaning of our lives, that we tend to, maybe even subconsciously, but we tend to develop rituals, symbols, and beliefs around that. And one other thing, I will come back to say a little bit more about that, but let me go ahead and say one other thing that Fowler says about faith, that faith is not always religiously oriented. It's not always traditionally religiously oriented. that a lot of us find places in life that give us meaning outside the realm of what we would call religion. For instance, for some people, family is the source of meaning in their lives. That's what means the most to them. That's kind of the place they go back to when they're trying to make sense out of life is family. And Fowler would say that that means that person is putting faith in family as a source of meaning, purpose, stability in life. And that there are certain rituals, symbols, and beliefs associated with that. And we talk about that with different sources of meaning in my live classes. And so with family, you know, what would be some rituals that are part of family being what we've decided is our source of meaning? Well, maybe spending holidays together, not missing rites of passage that happen within our families, births, deaths, graduations, weddings, funerals, that we participate in those things, in those rituals as demonstrations that family really is what's most important to us. I mean, if somebody says family is my source of meaning, but they don't ever celebrate a birth in the family, they don't make going to funerals a priority, they don't celebrate birthdays for people, they don't show up for holiday gatherings, you'd question whether it's really their source of meaning. It's participation in those rituals that indicate this means something to me. He says that it's expressed through symbols. Again, if family is what's priority, if it's the source of meaning, I might have I have some symbols that would demonstrate that potentially. I've got one of my grandmother's high school class rings. I've got different photos of family hanging around my house. I've got little mementos from great-grandmothers hanging on my wall. That there's symbols that we have that they're not just, they kind of go beyond sentimental. They have some deeper meaning for us if they come from our family and they demonstrate the importance of family to us. And then he says there's certain beliefs that go with that source of meaning. Family matters most. You can always count on your family. Blood's thicker than water. Those are statements of belief that would indicate, I think family is pretty high priority. It's a source of meaning. Now, obviously, there's symbols, rituals, and beliefs with traditional religions. We're pretty familiar with those. But Fowler would say that all of us are in a process of negotiating what really makes life meaningful to us. We're all trying to figure that out. Is it a religious tradition? Is it some sort of more personal experience of some sort of spirituality? Is it my family? Is it my job and my career? Is it just me and self-satisfaction? That we're all trying to figure out what makes our lives meaningful. And Fowler would say we're moving through a process of that. And that faith development is about how we're trying to negotiate what makes life meaningful for us. So when he's talking about this, he would say we all are developing faith, or we all are answering these questions about meaning. As a matter of fact, when he defines faith development, he says that faith development is the making, maintenance, and transformation of human meaning. It's the making, maintenance, and transformation of human meaning. Right now, as a college student, you're trying to make sense out of what's meaningful for you. And maybe the major you've chosen, or maybe your desire to take this class as part of your major, is part of your trying to determine what's meaningful to you, what's going to build a meaningful life for you. A survey a few years ago of college students indicated, surprisingly even to me, that just above pursuing a college education, or what matters the most in life is pursuing a college education to make money, just above that was building a meaningful life, doing something meaningful in life. And we're all trying to make that. And as we determine that, we take steps to try to maintain whatever that is. And ultimately, that brings about transformation in us. That as we take a hold of what we think is meaningful in life, then we begin to make changes in life to align ourselves with whatever that is. Sometimes it's things that are good for us, sometimes it might be things that aren't good for us. But regardless, Fowler would say that we're all in this process, on this journey of trying to figure out what's meaningful to us. And so in that sense, we all move through these stages that he talks about here that we're going to talk about. So first of all, he looks at 5 chronological life stages. He looks at our preschool age, in grade school, adolescence, college, young adult, and career and family. Now, in my live classes, typically what I do at this point is I put like 4 of those stages on the board. Preschool, later elementary, 4th, 5th grade, later high school, early college, and then adult, career, family phase. And I break students up into groups. All we've talked about is what we've talked about now, what I've talked about with you. And I ask students to think about people in each of those stages of life. What they would say about how people in those stages are negotiating meaning in their life. What they're understanding about what matters in life and what doesn't in life. What they're understanding about beliefs. What they're understanding about values. And you know, it's amazing every time, every class, as they do that for stages in these groups of usually 5 or 6, when they come back, their lists line up really well with what Fowler says goes on in those stages. Of course, he says some of these things in a little more academic ways, but you know, he's just observing what goes on in life. Now, as he goes through that, let me go ahead and I'll list the stages here for you, and then we'll go back and we'll talk about each of these stages. He actually has a kind of a pre-stage that he calls the undifferentiated stage, 0 to 3 years. And then he starts into the 6 stages. The first one is the preschool age that he calls intuitive project, and you have this there in front of you so you can see how to write this out. The second stage is the grade school age that he calls mythic literal. The third stage is adolescence, and he calls that synthetic conventional. The fourth stage is young adult, so you know, maybe college age or just out of college. He calls individuative reflective. The fifth stage is like career and family stage of life. He calls that conjunctive. And a sixth stage he calls universalizing faith. So let's go through and talk about each of these for a little bit. That first sort of pre-stage that Fowler talks about is what he calls undifferentiated. And this is from birth to about 3 years old. I know I've always, you know, my background, part of my background is in psychology and in psychology of religion, or excuse me, psychology of education. And one thing I think that I've heard often is that what is put in us in our first 3 years is kind of what gets hardwired into us. That it's not that it's impossible, but it's hard to unhook the things that have been wired into us during our first 3 years. All that is building who we are and who we're becoming as people. And that's kind of what Fowler says here. He says that experiences in this stage, these first 3 years of our lives, with things like trust, courage, love, hope, security, those underlie everything that comes later. They're kind of like the hardwired part of us that everything else streams from. And if you think about that, you can kind of see how that happens for a kid. I mean, if there's an infant and they learn, lying in their crib, that if they can holler and scream and scratch themselves and pull the mobile down hanging over their head and make all kinds of noise, and no one may show up to help them with this little bellyache that they have, or that they're laying there in a wet diaper, or whatever's uncomfortable to them. They can make all the noise in the world, and it's chancy whether someone's going to show up to help them. Those kids tend to grow up to be people who decide, I'm not sure I can count on anybody to take care of me except me. And so when something's bothering me, I'm going to take care of my needs, because I can holler and scream all I want, and I don't know who's going to show up or if anybody will. On the other hand, if you got a baby that's laying there in the crib and they whimper, and mom and dad and grandma and big brother and big sister are all there to find out what the whimper was about and try everything they can to fix the whimper, those kids tend to learn, all I got to do is give a little whimper about something and everybody wants to meet my needs. And I've seen some of those kids as teenagers that come to that point. And then there's kind of that balance that hopefully a lot of our parents try to find of meeting the needs that we have, but also sometimes letting us deal with some of the discomfort of life when it's not going to be something that harms us or hurts us. But all of that causes us to develop certain ways that we approach people, that we approach groups, that we approach the world around us. And so, Fowler starts out by saying that kind of lays the foundation for how we begin pursuing meaning in our lives, and even how much we feel responsible for taking a hold of the pursuit of meaning and the maintenance and making of meaning in our lives. So the first stage he talks about is this preschool age. Again, the technical name he gives this is intuitive project. Probably what I'm more interested in you remembering, which I think is more descriptive, is kind of a nickname that he gives that stage, and he calls that stage the innocent. And basically in this stage, he says these things. And again, it's always amazing to me how much this lines up with what students observe as we talk about this in class. He says, first of all, that everything's understood through family experience. That basically, at the preschool age, a child tends to reflect parental values, parental beliefs, parental faith. I mean, at this stage, that is the strongest influence. Even if kids are getting influence from a preschool or a daycare, it's selected by parents. And so they are still kind of overseeing whether they want that kind of influence for their kids or not. And so in that, kids tend to reflect, again, it's kind of being wired into them in a way that they aren't even consciously choosing. But the family has the strongest experience at this point. It's not like most preschoolers have a sense that there's something else out there that they might be missing out on, that they could understand about life, and so they want to go out and explore these other beliefs and values. In their minds, what they see, what they experience, what's immediate around them, that's the world. And it doesn't really go beyond that. And so that's largely influenced by parents at this point. He goes on to say in this stage that kids tend to have the family's perspectives on things like death, sex, religion, and even strong taboos that might become a part of a child's initial development. That those come from the family. And it's largely reflected by the family. However the family deals with death, when the preschooler's kitten dies, or the dog dies, or maybe grandmother dies, or grandfather dies, the first things that they hear from their parents about what that means, or where grandma is, or where Boo-Boo the kitty is, or whatever the case is, they begin shaping their ideas about death. They begin shaping their ideas about whether there's something beyond physical death or not, based on what the family tells them. They begin shaping their ideas about whether it's an awful, fearful, scary thing, based on how the family responds to that. They develop family values about things like death, sex, body image, and also religion and strong taboos. What's okay and what's not okay. And again, at this stage, everything is real or true to the kids. There's not, those of you who study educational development know that at these early ages, that kids don't really have an ability to grasp what's real and what's fantasy. They start learning that in a later stage. At this stage, it's all real. Santa, the Easter Bunny, Spider-Man, Grandma, Grandpa, their dog, it's all equally real to them. And there's not the ability to distinguish between what's fantasy and what's real. And so everything is kind of taken in and believed at this stage. Again, largely influenced by parental action and parental choices. The second stage that Fowler talks about is the one he calls Mythic Literal, and he says that this would be ages 6 to around 11. And the name, kind of the nickname he gives this, that again I think is easier for you and for me to remember, is he calls this stage the Literalist. And he says that this stage is still a reflection of others' beliefs, primarily parents' beliefs, but the influence is beginning to widen beyond the family. And they're in elementary school now. They're maybe going to friends' houses. They're spending the night with friends. They're involved in clubs at school. They might be involved in a team or a musical group or a band. And in that, they're beginning to encounter other belief systems besides that of their family, other value systems besides that of their family, maybe other religious belief systems besides that of their family. But at this stage, it's still all pretty straightforward and very literal. Everything is black and white. At this stage, they begin to understand real and fantasy. At this stage, there's kind of this understanding of what you say to me is literally true. That's the literalist. But they usually don't grasp the deeper symbolism of things. At this age, kids in a religious tradition might be becoming indoctrinated into their religious tradition. They might be having to go to classes now to learn what their religion believes and what their religion teaches. And some of the kids might be really good at reciting those things back from rote memory. But the likelihood that they grasp or even care about any deeper symbolism of that is pretty slim. This is a pretty simple and secure age for most. And it also is an age where they can begin to be a little frustrated with those who believe otherwise. I think it was around this age that, in my small rural elementary school, that two friends and I began having discussions about baptism and the role of baptism in people's lives. And we each represented kind of the three churches in our small town. And each church had a different perspective about the role of baptism. This was the age that some of us were being baptized, or friends of ours were. And there was frustration that there was another way to think about this than the way my family and I think about it, or one of my friends and their family think about it. That was frustrating for them that somebody thought differently. So at this stage, there begins to be a recognition that, one, there are other value systems out there, there are other belief systems out there, and two, they're not all like mine. They're not all like the one that I grew up with. But at this stage, there's still kind of a need to hang on to what I grew up with, and so a result is frustration with people who think differently. Then he moves on to the adolescent age, junior high, high school. He calls this, again, synthetic conventional, but the nickname he gives this is the Loyalist. And what Fowler really emphasizes here is that a child's development of what's meaningful in life, what they value, what things they believe, at this age, it's tightly linked to the group that they are loyal to, that the group that they feel their identity within. Now, for some kids, this could be family. For a lot of kids, it's not. Again, it might be a team that they're a part of. It might be just a circle of friends they're a part of. In some places, it might be a gang that they're a part of. But there's a group of people that they find their identity in, and they're loyal to that group, and so their beliefs and values are shaped by that group that they're a part of. So he says faith development, or development of understanding what's meaningful, what's valuable, what you believe, takes place in the context of a group at this age. This is an age where there's a lot of conforming, where you don't want to be different. What you believe about the clothes you should wear is probably reflective of the group that you're a part of. What you believe about what's cool to do on the weekends is probably reflective of the group that you're a part of. What you believe about how you feel about your mom and dad is probably reflective of the group that you're a part of. There's a lot of conforming. And so it's important that beliefs and practices meet the approval of the peers in that group. There's two observations that Fowler makes about this stage. The first observation he makes is that this is the stage that's hardest to progress beyond. I mean, if you think about it, we'd like to think that just junior high kids and high school kids have problems with peer pressure. But for a lot of adults, it's important to meet the approval of a circle of peers that we are in, whether it's in our careers, it might be in a church setting, it might be in some social club, it might be some sport or hobby that we participate in. But there's a sense of needing to meet the approval of those that we are part of, even as adults. And so Fowler makes the observation that this is probably the hardest stage to move beyond. It may dress itself up differently as we mature chronologically. But that conforming of ourselves to a group is common among a lot of people at all ages. And so he says it usually takes a crisis to push someone to move on to these next stages. Barring any crisis, there's a lot of comfort in peer approval and in fitting in and conforming to a group, fitting socially in what's going on. The other observation that he made in the surveys that he did is that this stage, this loyalist stage, is the stage that he found through surveys that he did to be most common in adult church members. Again, I always ask students to think about that and talk about that a little bit in class. What do they think about that? Did Fowler's survey indicate what they see? That most adult church members, it's important to them to conform to the group that they're part of, to meet the approval of the group that they're part of. One example, I think of several examples of that, but one example I think of is back during the 2000 elections. I believe it was 2000. John Ashcroft was running for senator in the state of Missouri. And I drove by a large church here in Springfield, and on the marquee outside, the sign said, and this was a large church, and from the sign it indicated there's multiple services on Sunday morning. So, you know, I would guess there's at least a few thousand people that are part of this church. And the marquee outside the church building said, "We support John Ashcroft." And my first thought when I saw that sign was, everybody in that church supports John Ashcroft? I don't really care whether they support Ashcroft or not. But what's the likelihood that if 2,500 people are part of that church, that all 2,500 supported John Ashcroft? Well, if someone was part of the Loyalist stage, and their intention was not to vote for Ashcroft, but for Carnahan, and there's a whole other story with that because he ended up dying before the election, so basically a dead man ran against a live man in that election. But if someone was planning to vote for Carnahan, who won, by the way, I'm sorry, that's my cell phone. Go back a little, or what should I just...
Pick it up from just right before where you left off.
Okay.
You said like he won, by the way, I think was the last thing you said. So somewhere in there would be fine.
Okay. Carnahan actually won, by the way, but if someone was planning to vote for Carnahan that was in this Loyalist stage, that was part of this church group that says on their marquee, "We support John Ashcroft," would someone in the Loyalist stage go in and say, "Well, I don't, I'm going to vote for Carnahan"? Probably not. Now, presumably there were other people part of that church group that were not in the Loyalist stage, and they probably went in and said, "Well, I don't. I mean, I know the sign says that we do, and maybe a lot of people here do, but I don't." But someone in the Loyalist stage probably wouldn't say that. They probably would just keep quiet, nod their heads, smile politely in any conversations about that, and on election day, go vote for the other guy. So in this stage, it's important to fit in. It's important to be a part. And again, Fowler says that typically it's only a crisis of some sort, a disappointment in that group, something that happens that the group doesn't come through, the group dynamic doesn't fulfill what's needed, that moves someone to the next stage. That next stage, the fourth stage, he calls individuative reflective. And this is like late teens, early 20s. So this would be probably college age, just out of college. And he calls this stage the critic. And you can see that, the questioner. I mean, it's at this stage that most people are starting to say, okay, I know what values and beliefs my parents handed me. And I know the values and beliefs of my peers. But I'm ready to come to a point that I want to value and believe in and find purpose in what I think matters. my own personal perspective on things. Not the peer perspective, not the parental perspective, but my own. And so you begin to critique, to ask, to question at this stage. And so some of the characteristics that Fowler mentions is that there's a lot of questioning, doubting, and searching at this stage. There's a desire to take charge of one's own life. And so again, this leads to questions of meaning. I know what my family says my life ought to be about. I know what my friends think life ought to be about. But what do I think life should be about? Fowler says that at this stage, it can be difficult to find a faith community, or even sometimes to find a circle of friends to join in this questioning, because you're kind of swimming upstream at this point. If most people are in a conforming stage of life, conforming to whatever group they're a part of, and I'm at a point where I'm stepping outside that and I'm saying, well, what if I don't want to buy into that? What if I don't want to vote for Ashcroft and I like to say some stuff about that? Then that person sometimes is left standing alone. Even if in personal one-on-one conversations at the side, other people are going, well, I got the same questions. What a lot of people find is when they step up and start asking those questions, those other people get real silent real quick. That it's hard to find a circle of people to be a part of that are willing to join in that questioning and in that struggle. And so Fowler says that what some people do in this questioning, searching, struggling, sort of criticizing stage is, as they find themselves pretty alone in that, what some people do is they just move back to the security of the loyalist stage. Well, I know how to play the game. I can just keep my mouth shut on what I think differently about. I'll just be a part of this group and say nothing. Some people find some way to, again, to kind of negotiate these questions, to deal with these doubts, and they move on to the next stage. But again, a lot, Fowler suggests, return to the security of the conforming stage, the loyalist stage. That next stage, though, that some people do move on to, he calls the conjunctive stage. And to kind of help students remember this, this is the same word that's the idea of a conjunction. And I don't know how many of you remember, but it seems like a lot of students still do, what the function of a conjunction is based on a song that a lot of us heard when we were growing up. But the function is that it connects things together. It takes and puts "and" in between several things and puts them all in this train that all connects to each other. And so that's what's going on here, is someone's beginning to connect all the dots now. They probably haven't answered all their questions. They probably still have some doubts and criticisms, but there's some things they're figuring out. They're starting to put together. I've given it a different nickname than what Fowler gives this stage. It's either the saint or the seer that he calls this stage, but I call it the builder. You know, this is someone who tends to be that kind of post-college age. They're getting started in their career. They may be starting a family. And they've decided, I need to put these pieces together and build what my life is about, and also build the kind of life that I can pass on to someone else, to my children, to the people I teach, to the people I influence on my job, that it's time to build what's mine. And so there tends to be an acceptance or rejection of various types of faith focus. At this stage, you may accept what your family handed to you years ago and decide, you know, I really think that makes most sense to me. At this stage, you might reject that. At this stage, you might accept that I think I want my life to be about family. Or I want the next several years of my life to be about building financial security and financial stability through a career that accelerates that for me. But there's a certain way that at this stage we begin to throw out the things that don't matter, and we begin to more tightly embrace the things that we think do matter. So we're rebuilding, we're putting the pieces together. And one thing that this is sometimes called by other paradigms of faith development is that this is a stage that you might call owned faith, or established faith, or an established value system. That I've decided what I want my life to be about, and this is kind of going to set the trajectory for the rest of my life as far as I can see at this point. Typically at this stage, again, not all the questions are answered. And so there tends to be a willingness to build, to connect what we've come to understand and know and to build on that. And also a willingness to accept some of the places that are more ambiguous to us, where maybe even there's some dissonance, where things don't quite make sense. But there's enough stuff that does, that we're willing to move on in that. The sixth stage that Fowler talks about, again, kind of the more technical name he gives it, is the stage of universalizing faith. I've chosen to call that the genuine, or maybe the integrated. And the idea that Fowler talks about in this stage is that one's values, one's belief system is integrated throughout their life. That the way they treat people, their ethics, their values on their job or in their career, the way they spend their money, the things they spend their money on, the ways they invest their time, are all pretty consistent with what they say they believe. There's not a lot of double standard in a person's life that's in this stage. It goes beyond just belief, that it's pervasive in an understanding of all of life. It's someone that all you got to do is watch their life for a while, and you can say, oh, it looks like to me the environment is really important to you. And they would say, yeah, that's true. And you can see that by the decisions they make, the ways they spend their money, the places they go, the kinds of things they buy, the kinds of things they don't buy. That belief about the value of environment and preserving the earth that we live on is consistent in their lives. That's this idea of this genuine, this universalized faith. Now, there's some implications about that, but I want to give a broader list of implications here from all these stages. What you'll see here is a list of that. First of all, even though, as we've gone through this, and as Fowler developed it, these stages were connected to biological age, or to a chronological age sequence. The first implication is that these stages are not necessarily connected to biological age. I mean, you've got those two earlier stages where we think of kids who just spout off what they believe based on what their family has ingrained in them. And if you ask them at 6 or 7 years old what they mean by that, and they don't know, you would expect that. Or you ask them, so is that belief really important to you? It kind of just goes over the head of a 6 or 7-year-old. And we would expect that. But don't you know some adults that are kind of like that? And I talk to people every once in a while that, I guess because I teach religion, we get in discussions about their personal religion, and they'll tell me that they're part of some particular religious tradition. And so I'll begin to ask some questions like, so is that tradition really important to you? Well, kind of. Or do you participate in that tradition? Well, not really, maybe a couple times a year. Well, what is it that is important to you about that tradition? Actually, I don't really agree with much about the tradition, but it's what my family is, and if I change traditions, my family would die, grandmother would roll over in her grave. Well, those are people that at maybe 30 years old, they're really in one of those first two stages of faith development, where what they say gives meaning to them in their lives isn't really what gives meaning to them in their lives. What they project as a belief system isn't really their belief system. They're just saying what's been fed to them, what's been indoctrinated into them, but they don't really buy into it. And yet, on the other hand, I know some pretty young people that have dealt with some hard things in life that have began questioning and searching before they're in college. I was a freshman in high school when my brother, who was a year younger than me, was hit and killed by a drunk driver. Well, at 13, 14, I was asking a lot of questions that my peers weren't asking. But that crisis brought me, I think, a little more into that critic stage on an earlier end. And some of you could probably say the same thing. If you dealt with tragic things early in life, there may have been some questions you were asking that everybody else in your junior high or freshman class weren't asking. Secondly, Fowler says that no stage is inherently good or bad. They're all just part of a process. Generally, I'll ask students, so just looking at these stages, and we'll have them up on the board, or I'll have them on a PowerPoint. which of these would people say is the worst or the bad one? And they almost always say the critic. Because that's when people are rebelling, that's when people are abandoning what their family taught them, that's when they're trying all kinds of things, some things they probably don't need to try or wish they hadn't. And what Fowler would say is, that might be a scary stage, but if people are willing to question what they believe, that's really probably a good thing. I always ask students that critic stage is the 4th stage. And the 5th stage is when someone then says, this is my established owned faith. This is my established owned belief system. And I always ask students, do you know people who would say they have an established owned belief system, value system, but they've never questioned it? They've never been in the critic stage? And I always ask my students, what are those people like? They usually say things like closed-minded, unwilling to listen to other viewpoints, not really very thoughtful about what they believe. They just spout it off, but they don't really even understand what it means. Because they haven't gone through that critic stage and been willing to question a little bit to really sharpen and clarify their own personal value system. Again, a class like this allows you to move around in that critic stage a little bit and clarify what you want to build as far as a value system for your own life. And again, I'm not here to tell you what value system to build or what belief system to build, but we're all building one in one way or another. And this is a class that provides an opportunity to ask some questions as we do that. Third thing Fowler says, which I mentioned earlier, is that most people do not progress beyond that loyalist stage. Most people stay in that more conforming, group-oriented, need to meet the approval of peers stage. A fourth thing that Fowler says is that in reference to that last stage where one's beliefs are pervasive throughout their life, where it's pretty genuine throughout their life, Fowler said that in his research, only 2% of people reach that stage. And if you think about it, there are a lot of us have a lot of double standards about things in our lives. I think most students in my live classes would like to think that's a higher percentage, and it may be in some circles. But Fowler's research showed that only 2% reach that kind of integrated value system in their lives, or what they say they believe is integrated throughout the decisions, the choices that they make. A fifth implication of this paradigm is that it's not necessarily a linear process. It's not necessarily a process where people start at 1 and move straight to 6. Again, obviously, as Fowler said, 1, not everybody reaches 6 or 5 or 4. And the other thing is that it probably is a little more fluid, where we tend to move and bounce back and forth between these because we're always trying to make, maintain, and transform what we think is meaningful in life. At this stage of life, whatever stage you're in right now, maybe you're a traditional college student, maybe you have a family and you've been in a career, but you're taking some of these classes to try to change direction. You know, maybe you've landed in one way that you see life and that you approach life. But as you transition beyond this stage of life, you may start renegotiating some of those matters of what's really meaningful and what you want to put your focus on in life. And so we tend to kind of be sort of fluid in this process. It's not just a straight line process. The final thing that, if you're somebody who wants to take time to ponder a few questions, is just to think about what makes sense about this paradigm. What kind of, as I talked about it, you're like, yeah, I really see that. What doesn't make sense about this paradigm? Again, it's a humanly constructed paradigm based on research of human behavior, but it's not some divine mandate out of some divine source. There's probably some things that don't click for you in this paradigm. I think it's interesting to think about what an adult in stage 1 or stage 2 or stage 3 might look like as far as their value system and their beliefs. And finally, between those last 2 stages, someone who's kind of built what they want life to be about, and then someone who has that really integrated throughout their life, what would you see as the difference between those 2 people as far as what their lives look like and how they live out their lives and how they make the choices that they do?
we're going to move on in the next couple sessions, or probably more than a couple sessions, and talk about some of the focuses or foci that people have as far as matters of faith. Whether there's something else out there that's divine or not, and how people come to some of those conclusions.